Materials provided by Winsor & Newton.
When you showed me this drawing, I couldn't believe that it was a pencil and pen drawing. I just assumed, looking at the range of grays that you created, that it had to be done with ink wash. You're achieving this effect with pencil. How did you come up with this approach?
I always struggled with controlling how dark I get with my ink works. I ended up with a lot of drawings that were like 70% black, and then you kind of lost all the subtlety. And then I looked back at my graphite sketches and like my sketchbooks. How did I get all this grays, and how do I achieve this in an ink wash? And then I was like, why do I have to use ink? This is working fine with my pencil, so why not just use pencil?
Is it a matter of control that the pencil is just easier to control than ink wash?
Ink washes are really hard to like subtract from because it's there. You have to paint over to fix it.
You paint it and you're like, oh, that's the gray I want. And then it dries and it's not the same
It's not
gray.
wrong one. I'm comfortable using graphite. I've learned how to use it and I know the range of it. So why not just use graphite and then maybe add my pen and ink touches in the end?
For a lot of people, when they're working with ink wash, the tendency is for them to get maybe 2, maybe 3 shades of gray. But I look at this drawing and I feel like there are 30 shades of gray. The gray is where people really struggle.
Pencil is one of those things where you learn intuitively. Everybody has held a pencil. The harder you press, the darker the line. When you go into more professional art tools, pencils come in so many different hardness. 3H, 2H, 1H, 2B, 3B, 4B, 5B, like those are really soft lead. So just having the variety of the pencil tools, that is already giving you infinite amount of shades.
I also like that the pen over the pencil seems to give the drawing a sense of structure. I know for a lot of people when they work in pencil, it feels almost mushy in a way because you don't get that crispness that the line of a pen can create. So I think it's a really great combination. You go for walks a lot in nature.
That's one of the ways I just get out of studio. But then through walks, I will find a lot of interesting things. So it's a great way for getting inspiration, getting exercise.
We actually went out to the grocery store and had a lot of fun looking at all the weird produce and vegetables. Like, what is this?
Just because you got this one object doesn't mean it has to stay in this form. You could cut it up.
And that's not something you can do with an image from the internet. You're not going to find an image of a mushroom and be able to see the inside of the mushroom. I think that's what's nice about having the actual object right in front of you. Now, you were very specific about which items you wanted to pick. You told me that you didn't want to use broccoli. I mean, broccoli's cool. It's got texture. What do you have against broccoli?
Broccoli is so recognizable. There's no surprise to it. You might as well get lion's mane mushroom if you have it.
You use printmaking paper for this technique, and I think that's very unusual.
I really just like the feel of the printmaking paper. You could have some deckled edges. This one in particular has a kind of fibrous feel to it. So it's almost like you're working on top of fabric. If you are working on something smooth and sleek, each pencil mark, you will see each line. Whereas here, it almost blends it for you.
You chose printmaking paper that's slightly tinted.
It adds a little bit of warmth. So it doesn't have to be necessarily warm. It could be like a gray tint or a blue tint or a pink tint. But just having this warmth is comfortable for the eyes. It's just like it gives it a good mood.
You sometimes have a very defined graphic shape in the background. Sometimes it's a circle or an oval or even a square.
I always loved mixing like graphic shapes with something very organic. Sometimes my organic shapes are kind of overwhelming. I wanted something to ground it, something that the organic forms can grow out of. I might just have a vague idea, like I want a circular shape. As soon as I determine that, I just look around the studio. Things like this, it has a shape, and then I just simply trace it. Try to look around for interesting shapes. If you compare organic forms like corals, corals kind of look just like mushrooms. Mushrooms are land corals. Finding similar shapes, matching them up.
So basically, you just want to mess with us.
Yes. Is it water? Is it on land? Who knows? I think that's fun, though.
Any provocative artwork is going to have the flexibility for people to bring their own interpretation to it. So I like this idea of having the landscape being somewhat undefined so people can really make it what they want it to be.
I was in Italy one summer. I realized I didn't have to work so hard because the city was already so beautifully composed. In a similar way, a lot of these nature items, they're already very beautiful. They already have a beautiful like curvature, structure, texture that it doesn't take that much effort for me to like sit and just be inspired by it.
We didn't just buy 2 objects and call it a day. You had so many items to choose from, and between the quantity and the variety of surfaces and textures and shapes that we had, it's almost like you can't go wrong. Sometimes I have students who are so frustrated with their images, and I say, "Well, what were you drawing from?" And they say, "I drew an apple." I said, well, that's why you're bored, because you just bought 1 apple. That's not a lot to work with. I like to go the opposite way, which is to give myself too much to work from. And it's just a matter of picking and choosing. Are there certain shapes that you just won't do?
I really want to stay more of a geometric shape just because my forms are so organic and fluid. But there are certain shapes I just get away from because it's too recognizable. That weird like rectangle with the curved corners, it's just so recognizable. Like we all have one in our house.
You don't do all the line work first. You're going back and forth between the two. You're doing a little bit of line in one section, adding some shading, going back to the line, adding some shading. My first instinct, if I were doing this, would be to fill in all the line work and then do all the shading. Why do you break it up in such a fragmented way?
Finishing one complete step almost eliminates your potential to make something more interesting. If you focus on one corner at a time, you are looking at one thing as a way that you're going to finish. Even in the pencil stage, leaving room for more is always better than completely finishing and eliminating a process to add.
It's almost like you want to just keep all your doors open. You can say, okay, well, that is still an option. But if you close all the doors, then you will never see that as an option. So I think that's a great way of really maintaining a certain level of flexibility in your mind.
So you know how a page usually has a foreground, middle ground, background, and that's the atmosphere perspective, the idea of rule of 3. I like to have one large object in one corner, a smaller circle, and then in a different, the last corner, maybe top left, and it's like a smaller object. An angle, so it forms a triangle within a page. When you only have one, that's just too much focus and pressure on one object. When you have 2, it is symmetrical. You have the foreground, middle ground, background. That's rule of 3. You could do 5. Odd numbers are always just a lot more dynamic in an image.
Is there a specific order that you use the pencils in?
It doesn't really matter between the 4H and the 2H, but I personally just like to start with the lightest. 4H is the hardest, but it's also the lightest. I can do scribble marks without really marking up the page. I'm also keeping a very light pressure, so it's not like I'm carving into the paper. So with the 4H, I like to form like the biggest shape. With the 2H, I add a little bit more detail, break down the big forms. And then with the B, that's where the details come in. That's where like the shading comes in. I like to switch between 2H and B to add some of the shadows. The B definitely is still soft enough to show some of the graphite pigment. It's still hard enough to stay put. I think the matte medium serves a couple of purposes. It gets rid of the shine of the graphite. That graphite shine gets really distracting in like a bad lighting studio.
So I hate that. It's
yeah.
horrible to photograph a pencil drawing. It's so shiny.
Having a matte medium neutralizes that. The matte medium almost acts as a binder. Think about the graphite as the pigment that's like sitting on the paper. The matte medium just subtly blends it into this beautiful ink wash effect.
Here with the matte medium painted over the pencil looks so soft. Not really qualities I associate with pencil. Would you say you need the matte medium to dry overnight?
Based on the brand, it could differ, but I would say like 30 minutes to an hour, dry to the touch. If it's still in the process of drying, it feels cold. If you're using like a pretty stiff brush, you might end up with streaks. And that's something that you might have to sand down with a very, very fine grit paper, 300 or 350 grit sandpaper, and just a very smooth process of sanding.
Yeah, you barely sanded it. And then you also followed up with a paper towel. Is that just to get rid of some of the powder left over?
Yes.
We really couldn't figure out what eraser you're using because I'm so particular about the brand and type of eraser, but you said you didn't even know what it is?
It was the same eraser I've been using for years, like something that you go into the store and just says eraser on it. Going to your class, and then we were doing charcoal drawings. And then you had a list of very particular erasers, one that has to be like pushed out like a lead pencil, one that was like the kneaded
Well,
eraser,
they're all
and then
different.
like the hard rubber eraser. I was just like, what in the world? I didn't even know there were that many eraser types. I just have the one. I didn't even think it was me being like particular about it. You're the one who's particular. You
No,
have
I'm
a
not.
list.
I know what I want.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, you're Goldilocks. So you have like a
No,
five
no, no, no,
thing.
no. I have very defined
Mhm.
erasers. I know what their
You're
names
Goldilocks. You are a greedy Goldilocks that wanted all three. So I just picked up whatever that was cheapest in a store.
are. Oh, so
Like,
you're so
no.
accommodating.
Yeah, it was affordable. I'm not sure like what I'm using right now.
Art supplies are funny because sometimes I'm very particular about what I want, and other times I'm like, just use a paper towel. Who cares, right? So I think it just comes down to personal preferences. You obviously are using the eraser to get rid of mistakes. I think that's pretty clear for a lot of people, but you're also using the eraser to clear out larger areas. Are you just trying to get rid of the extra marks, or is there something else going on?
I like to use the eraser flat. There's a lot of like stray scribbles I'm not using. Some of the like differences between the 2H and the B. It's almost like rubbing a tissue over the paper to blend in pencil. And I just want to soften that up.
I definitely have seen a lot of people, when you give them an eraser and a pencil, they get so picky about their drawing that they actually erase more than they draw. And at the end of 30 minutes, they still haven't drawn anything. But I'm noticing that when you draw, you don't really erase that much. Actually, the vast majority of the time, you're just putting the marks on the page. What's something somebody could do if they feel like that's happening, that the eraser is just removing all of their progress and they just are starting from nothing all the time?
Most of the time, a lot of interesting forms happen when you make a mistake and try to build on that. So instead of erasing that one stray line, incorporating that into a new composition, it is like an organic process. So people might draw really hard, even the eraser can't erase that. That is just a hard way to work because you can always add more with pencil. Taking away messes like your flow of process. And it's just easier to just go lightly in the first round and then go gradually darker or just build on the mistake.
One thing that I do with a lot of my introductory drawing classes is I don't let the students use an eraser for a while. And a lot of people freak out because they say, how am I going to do this drawing if I don't have the option to erase? And I say, well, you better figure it out because that's what you're going to be doing for a few weeks. And later on, it's very common for students to say to me, you know what, I really don't miss the eraser because the eraser was such a big distraction. And the nice thing about not having an eraser is you're just always going forward. You're always moving ahead. You're making progress. And you just find that when it's not an option to erase, it just really gets all of those worries to disappear because you just have to focus on the then and the now.
By not having an eraser, you focus a little bit more. Whenever I'm doing sketching with pen, I tend to be more careful. So I tend to be more like organized with my thoughts.
I'm shocked that you draw so fast because I always had the assumption that to get that type of detail, you would have to draw at a slow pace. Why are you drawing so quickly?
I think I tend to get faster because I start to be more organized. I probably might spend longer planning out the drawing with pencil. Eventually, when I'm like 60 or 70% done, I can already figure out what this is going to look like. So I have a clear idea where my lights are going to be, where I want my like looser line work, where I already have my tighter line work. So that just kind of makes me go faster because one, I'm like excited to see what happens. I'm excited to see what the ending result will look like if it matches what I'm thinking. And two, I'm over it. I just want to get it done. I'm like in a rush to see that.
You're basically saying that you get this adrenaline rush at the end of what I already thought was a marathon drawing. And that just seems amazing that all of a sudden you have this enormous drive towards the end of the piece. I feel almost frantic when I first start the drawing, and I love that initial push of energy. And I just get slower and slower and slower because I don't feel that desperation in the beginning. And you're the complete opposite of that. Now that the matte medium has dried, the paper is buckled a lot. Is there a way to fix that?
The easiest way is to just work on a watercolor block initially, where all the paper is kind of glued onto this flat surface. You could stretch the paper before working on it, or you could just press it between some books.
One thing I really like about this composition is that you are pretty clear about the weight distribution. There are definitely certain parts of the drawing that feel like they have tremendous weight.
I was really focused on making like a vertical growth, having the smaller, more delicate things like the fennel grow from it. It creates that upward movement. I really just like having that contrast of shape and textures.
At the same time, though, you also have a couple of forms that almost seem like they're defying the gravity of that. You're playing with your own rules in a way. And I just love that breaking of the norm. You're very deliberate about overlapping objects.
Overlapping is really important to me because it establishes depth without really relying on the value. It is one of the common methods of creating atmospheric perspective. Even these fennels, they aren't really varied in size, but just because they're behind a certain object, it looks like they're further away.
There's such a variation of scale. Like this gourd at the bottom looks huge. And then you've got these little tiny mushrooms that are just peeking around the corner. And I think it's establishing that contrast that's so helpful. I mean, picture if everything was the same size. This would be so boring to look at. Everything would be very monotonous.
I don't need to be hyper realistic on every aspect. There are areas of focus that I really want people to look into the detail, but then there's some areas that are fillers. I need to have some areas where the viewer can rest their eyes.
I think you and I both know that you totally have the skill to draw every single tiny pore in that mushroom. But the thing is, the fact that you choose to not do that, I think really helps you a lot because you're picking and choosing. You're not just going on automatic pilot and say, oh, I saw it, I have to draw it. You're being very selective. I see that the way the pen glides across the matte medium seems to help you a lot. If you were to put pen just over straight pencil with no matte medium, it wouldn't behave that way, right?
With matte medium, you're adding a glass layer over any sheet. Helps the ink flow.
If you use this pen on this printmaking paper with no matte medium, then it would be a disaster because this paper is so fibrous that I would think that the pen would just bleed everywhere and you would lose that rigidity of the line, which is so crisp and clear on the matte medium. It's such a brilliant solution. I really was not expecting you to put pencil over the pen.
I like to use the pencil to almost blend a lot of my ink marks. Graphite is also a very interesting way to just add a drop shadow or blend in some shades and push some areas back. It's almost like a blur filter.
It's a great way to exert a lot of control over a minor change. And I know for work, that's a big, big difference in the end.
And I was just coloring the graphite over my pen marks. I kind of treated this as like my last step. If I wanted to add on top of graphite again, that might require a different medium or like the pen might get clogged from the graphite. Really reserve that step for last. You've also noticed that sheen of graphite. To eliminate that, you would probably want to use matte spray. You could use matte fixative. So there's various kind of sprays. I just prefer using matte spray because I like having a matte finish to my look. Giving a good quick one coat of spray, you could get rid of that sheen from the graphite, flatten the image again. So matte spray is like just evens out everything, prepares it for a photograph, good for scanning. In art stores, they also have like UV sprays now, and that will protect it from sun damage. So there's a variety of things that you could try out.
You're adding a little bit of gesso to accentuate the circular shape.
I kind of want to also just bring out that shape that I initially had.
Now, did you actually dilute the gesso?
No, it was just straight gesso. I just kind of used dried brush.
If I hadn't watched you make this drawing from beginning to end, I would never have guessed that this drawing ever had pencil in it. It just comes across as a pen drawing. I think about your drawings almost as these illusions.
I think a lot of people, they stay very true to one medium at a time. I struggled with ink washes because I tend to go a little overboard and I get really dark very quickly. I needed a way for me to learn how to be more subtle with my gradations without working as hard to like figure out how to make this ink wash work. Like, I don't really believe in staying true to one medium. My focus is to make the image work. My focus is just to have a beautiful piece made. So whatever works, works. Like,
You mean a
still
tart pan?
Tart pan. Tart, it's a cup. Tart cup thing.
It's a tart pan.
It holds things. It's a cup.
We'll talk about this later.